Okay, so we're going to continue our conversation about chapter 12, part 1. So we left off talking about the thalamus and kind of how it's the major relay station for the brain. So the thalamus, again, contains a lot of different nuclei. When I say nuclei, it's just basically a cluster of cell bodies that have the same function. And so the thalamus, again, is a relay station from a lot of sensory information that's coming into the brain that can get sent out to kind of the higher cortical regions that process and kind of allow us to really interpret the sensory information that we're receiving. So it's located superior to the midbrain and contains nuclei that serve as relay stations for all sensory impulses. Like I said, we haven't really defined what a nuclei is, and a nuclei is a cluster of cell bodies. Sorry, there's a big bird that just kind of keeps hanging around here. Anyway, okay, so we talk about the hypothalamus, how hypothalamus is going to be inferior to the thalamus, meaning that it's just kind of below it, has 4 major regions. And so the 4 major regions are going to, again, structure and function are going to correlate here very closely. So you have the mammillary region, the tuberoid region, which is in blue, the supraoptic region, which is in green, and the purple region, which is at the preoptic area. Any place where you see the word optic, think ocular, eye. So there's a relay station for essentially the eye processing that's going to occur. What's really interesting about our visual system is that even though our eyes are located at the front of our head, our visual kind of tracks extend all the way through our brain and cross through kind of the middle of our brain and end up getting processed here at the very back of our brain called the occipital lobe. So again, anytime you see something in the brain that kind of starts with an O, ocular, occipital, any of those things, those are all going to be related to vision. So the supraoptic region, again, still related to vision. The tuberoid region and the mammillary region are going to have slightly different purposes. I don't think we'll get into the specifics of that now, but they do play very important roles for homeostasis, again, which is one of the major purposes or functions of the hypothalamus. Next, we have the epithalamus, which is going to be superior and posterior to the thalamus and contains the pineal gland, very important gland for hormonal control of the body. It secretes melatonin. Melatonin is a chemical that essentially signals things like the sleep-wake cycle. So that's a very important function of that region. The pineal gland secretes melatonin, and the habecular nuclei are involved in olfaction. When I say olfaction, it's your sense of smell. So again, your sense of smell is going to be also processed in your habecular nuclei. So if we look at even just kind of the location of it, it makes sense. Your pituitary gland is right down here. Your habecular nuclei is located very close to this. Your olfactory bulbs are also located right down in that region. When I say olfactory bulbs, those are kind of the bulbs that extend into your nose and allow for that sensory information to be received. So olfaction, think smell. Okay, your circumventricular organs, CVOs of the diencephalon. So those can monitor chemical changes in the blood because they have a very close relationship. So it's important to recognize, again, you've got this blood-brain barrier, that the blood-brain barrier is going to inhibit certain chemicals, certain even immunological factors from crossing into the brain. And so to keep those two things separate, it's very important. However, there are regions where you still have access. So these circumventricular organs are one place in which you have access to kind of that closer relationship with the blood, because that region lacks a blood-brain barrier. So it includes portions of the hypothalamus, the pineal gland, or the pituitary gland. Important because some of these glands will be releasing things like hormones that go throughout our entire body. So when we haven't kind of, I guess, distinguished between how certain cells send signals, we can think of neurotransmitter signals happening between two cells that are it's kind of a discrete interaction. You know, one cell sends a signal, the other cell receives a signal. Hormones, however, are kind of just diffused and released in the blood, and those can go throughout our entire body and then find their target of interest based off of the receptors that get expressed in cells, bind to those receptors and have their effects. And so these are the types of regions of the brain that are going to release hormones that get sent into the blood system and extend and send signals kind of throughout the entire body. So it's again, important that they have access to the blood so they can kind of use that superhighway of the blood to get to everywhere they need to go. They coordinate homeostatic activities of the endocrine and the nervous system. So the endocrine and the nervous system play very close relationships to one another. In some instances, you could say one controls the other, or the other controls one. They do play a very they have a very important feedback loop system to make sure that all the homeostatic processes that take place in the body stay nice and balanced. Okay, so the diencephalon, here you can see just kind of, again, if you are a table person, our book does a great job of breaking these sections down into tables. You see the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the epithalamus. Again, the thalamus is going to be that major relay station for a lot of the sensory information. Your hypothalamus is going to be very important for homeostasis, not surprisingly, because a lot of our processes that take place automatically are what maintains our homeostasis. It's our autonomic nervous system that is kind of activated via the hypothalamus. So again, think autonomic, automatic, homeostasis. Homeostasis just keeps everything going like it should be going. So it's going to release hormones, inhibiting hormones, oxytocin, antidiuretic hormone, which is going to play a role in kind of water balance in our body, regulate emotional and behavior patterns via the limbic system. That can be things like rage, anger, things such like that. Feeding and satiation centers that regulate eating. Thirst center, suprachiasmatic nucleus that regulates circadian rhythms when we sleep and when we wake, and then body temperature as well. So this, again, the diencephalon is considered kind of the old brain part of the brain, which carries out functions that, not even that simpler organisms would use. You think of your dog or your cat. Your dog and cat has these same structures. Now they don't have the higher cortical structures that allow them to do the critical thinking. However, they do have these structures that allow their bodies to maintain very similar homeostases that we do as humans. Lastly, the epithalamus consists of the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin. We talked a little bit about that function a few slides ago. And lastly, the orbicular nuclei, which is involved in olfaction. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the midbrain, the hindbrain, the diencephalon. Again, structures that are very deep within our own heads and brains. Again, you can think about it kind of as an evolutionary kind of perspective, right? Those things are very important for maintaining homeostasis, for our bodies to just maintain functioning. So it makes sense that they would want to be very deep within our skull and our brain to be very highly protected. Now, with that being said, some of the higher cognitive processes that we're going to talk about now are part of the cerebrum, kind of the outermost covering of the brain. And those, not just higher cognitive processes, there's a lot of sensory information that gets processed in the cerebrum as well, but it's not necessarily super critical to, maintaining breath and things like that. So again, it's just kind of an interesting way to think about the differences between kind of those older structures and then maybe the newer structures that have evolved more recently. So the cerebral cortex is composed of gray matter, which contains billions upon billions of neurons. I think the last time I read was maybe like 4.5 billion neurons. Basically, there are more, it takes 4 people's heads, you put them together, and that's as many stars as there are in our universe, which is just crazy. So this gray matter, if we remember the difference between gray matter and white matter, gray matter are cell bodies, white matter are the fiber tracts, those myelinated fiber tracts that are sending signals to and from different regions. So this whole kind of outer part of your brain has a lot of cell bodies that are going to be, again, interpreting, getting signals, sending signals back out. But those are cell bodies, those gray matters. And those, when you look at our brain, you see things like gyri, fissures, and sulci that can be identified on the cortex. So when I say things like gyri and sulci, I'm talking about, how you see on brains, how they look like they're really bumpy. Well, the bump part and the valley part are the differences are called essentially gyri and sulci. So we'll look at that in the next couple of slides, just to make sure that that's very clear. Deep to the cortex. So inside, essentially, the cortex is the white matter composed of tracts of neurons that connect parts of the brain to each other in the spinal cord. So if we do like a sagittal cross-section of the brain, you'll notice that there are those white fiber tracts that are essentially going through a lot of the middle part of the brain because you're sending and receiving those myelinated axons. And then again, right, kind of lining the outermost portion of it are the cell bodies, the gray matter. There's a bundle of white matter tracts called the corpus callosum that connects the 2 hemispheres. So we think of the brain as having kind of 2 halves. And so in order for those 2 halves to talk to one another, there's this region called the corpus callosum that kind of essentially sends fiber tracts from one side to the other and allows the 2 sides of the brain to speak to one another. And we'll do a We'll do a mid-sagittal cross-section of the brain, and we'll look at what the corpus callosum really looks like here. Okay, so this is a great image, just again, showing what we were just talking about in the last slide. So here you can see the gyrus, again, is the bump part of the brain, and then your sulcus is going to kind of be that valley. So you know when you look at a brain, it kind of has those bumps and valleys and things like that. The gyri are the bumps, the sulci are the valleys. If you generally, the number of gyri are directly proportional to the number of cell bodies, which might in some instances evolutionarily is tied to intelligence. With that being said, if you look at a human's brain versus, let's say, a dolphin's brain actually has a ton of gyri on it. They have highly, they just have a ton of surface area that provides them maybe the ability to be higher intelligent animals. And then if you go back and you look kind of at the other end, let's say if you looked at a lizard brain or a cat brain or a dog brain, there's going to be far fewer gyri and sulci. So again, not as much surface area, not as many cell bodies. And again, that kind of very loosely correlates to intelligence. We'll just use that terminology for now. But again, it just is an interesting evolutionary way to look at this. Again, if we look at the gray matter, you can see the gray matter just lining the very outside of these gyri. And then you can see the white matter here that are going to be the fiber tracts that are extending to the different regions. And so I get one of the major functions of, nervous cell tissue is to send and receive signals. So those white fiber tracts are very important. If you look at the superior view of the brain here, you can see, if we essentially cut the brain down the center, the mid-sagittal section, that's called the longitudinal fissure. And then you can even break the brain down into like the cerebrum specifically into other regions. There's this one kind of large fissure that exists right here, kind of halfway through the brain, and that's called the central sulcus, and it's pretty apparent on most brains. And so everything in front of that is called the precentral gyrus, and then everything behind that, or that first gyrus behind that, is called the postcentral gyrus. But that line, that central sulcus, kind of divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe that you can see here. And then lastly, you can see here at the very posterior of the head, you've got your occipital lobe. Like I said, the function of that's going to be primarily vision-based, but we'll talk about kind of the different lobes and the different functions here in the following kind of slides. But this is essentially just a nice big picture of the cerebral cortex, and I guess it's kind of nice to point out that this little section that you see here is essentially cut out from the cerebral cortex that's pictured. Okay, so the lobes. So again, different lobes have roughly different functions. We'll talk about some of the different functions that are dedicated to each lobe. You try to think of the brain as being kind of this clear cut, like this lobe does this thing, this lobe does that thing. But what's really cool about the brain is that it does have this thing called plasticity, meaning that it can rewire itself if necessary. So a lot of these different lobes, if there's, let's say, damage to one lobe, what's interesting is that it can actually reroute the function of that lobe to another lobe. So if, let's say, you were born with some type of ocular degeneration and your occipital lobe isn't being used for visual processing, that means that some of your other sensory information can kind of get rerouted to that region, and therefore you can maybe have a heightened sense of touch or a heightened sense of smell because that occipital lobe information is getting processed in a different way. Okay, so let's just go ahead and break down the lobes here. First, you have your frontal lobe. Frontal lobe, as we've learned from the skeletal system, is located here, very superior region of the head and brain. Next, you have the parietal lobe, and again, we've learned all of these kind of bone regions, and so hopefully recognizing the bones and the lobes correlate to one another. I kind of kept planting that seed, so hopefully that makes this pretty easy to learn. Your temporal lobe is located alongside kind of the more anterior part of your head, and then your occipital lobe is going to be that lobe kind of right back in the very most posterior part. There is a region called the insular as well. Again, that's kind of located tucked underneath here. We'll see the, you can see that kind of tucked underneath here, but we'll look at it via some different sections, and maybe it'll become a little bit more apparent. So again, frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe. Make sure you know the different lobes, and then we're going to talk about the functions here in a second. Okay, so the cerebral matter white tracts. And so we've talked about how there's gray matter kind of all on the surface of the cerebrum. The white matter tracts you can see here are located again, extending down into the deeper regions of the brain. So here you can see the commissure projection tracts. And what's when we talked about the corpus callosum a few moments ago. Remember how the corpus callosum connects to hemispheres of the brain? Here you can see the corpus callosum kind of in its actual full intended structure, and that's essentially the white matter tracts that are connecting the two sides of the brain. In terms of what I'm going to ask you to know from this slide, I think being able to recognize the corpus callosum is probably the most important thing. Other than that, recognizing that all of these other things that look kind of like spaghetti are actually just fiber tracts running from one region to another. So in addition to the white matter fiber tracts, you also have things called nuclei. Again, nuclei are kind of clusters of cell bodies that have very similar functions. And so the basal nuclei are paired masses of gray matter in each of the cerebral hemispheres. And so you can see here a series of different nuclei that are, again, having very similar functions in the cell bodies that they are generated. So the basal nuclei here, you can see the caudate nucleus, the putamen, as well as the globulus pallidus, and those are all going to be nuclei of a very specific type of cell that projects to different regions of the brain. So it's just important to recognize that the cell bodies of neurons don't only inhabit the surface of the cerebrum, but there are also different regions that are located deep within the structure of the brain where you have cell bodies that are projecting their axons to different regions that have very specific functions. You'll also see some gray matter in things like the thalamus, the subthalamic nucleus, the hypothalamus. You can see kind of each one of these colors here is representing a cluster of cell bodies, again, that project their neurons to different regions that have multiple varieties of functions. Okay, so I've mentioned the limbic system very briefly in previous slides. We're going to talk about it a little bit more here. So the limbic system is found in the cerebral hemispheres and the diencephalon. And so we've talked a little bit about both of these regions previously, right? And if we look at the limbic system, it's located, or it's shown in gray here. You can see there's quite a few different tracts. So you have your anterior nucleus of the thalamus, the mammillothalamic tract, the cingulate gyrus, the septal nuclei, the mammillary body, the olfactory bulb, the amygdala, the parahippocampal gyrus, the fornix, the hippocampus, and the dentate gyrus. These are all considered to be part of the limbic system. Now, that's a pretty long laundry list of structures to know that are in the limbic system. I won't necessarily ask you about specific structures, but I will be asking you about what the general function of the limbic system is. And we'll be talking about that here in a second. Okay, so one of the functions of the limbic system is to regulate and to generate certain emotional responses. And so some of those emotional responses could be anger, some of them can be fear, some of them can be joy and happiness, but the limbic system is part of the brain that really processes some of the emotions that we generate. The functional organization of the cerebral cortex. So when we're looking at the cerebral cortex, like again, the surface of your brain, you've got your frontal lobe, your parietal lobe, your occipital lobe, and your temporal lobe. Now, if we break down each one of those lobes, each one of those lobes has a fairly specific function. Your frontal lobe is going to be very important for higher level thinking, cognitive processing, plays some role in emotional regulation. We'll talk about your parietal lobe next. Your parietal lobe is very important for sensory information. And so this slide is talking about the types of sensory, motor, and integrative signals in certain specific regions of the cerebral cortex. You've got your sensory areas, your motor areas, and your association areas. And those are found quite most often, with the exception of your vision processing. You've got a lot of your motor sensory information being processed in your parietal lobe. And then you've got things like some auditory language processing that happens in your temporal lobe. So we'll talk about both of those coming up. Okay, so this is a great image because it shows you what regions of your cerebral cortex are involved in what part of your sensory processing. So this is actually a super informative image. So you have your primary motor area, which is again part of your parietal cortex you can see here. your primary somatosensory area. So this is, again, a lot of the information you're taking in from your skin and your surroundings, somatosensory, your touch. And so this is, again, when we talk about things going to and from your spinal cord, you'd be taking in your sensory information, your somatosensory information, and that would be being sent to this region here. And then your motor area would essentially kind of get that signal sent down back through your spinal cord to generate some type of response. And this is a premotor area. Here you can see a region that is your frontal eyelid area. If we go over here to your temporal lobe, you can see what's called your Broca's area, which is very important for speech. So your speech, language, and auditory processing, not surprisingly, is located very close to where your auditory organ is. Again, when I say auditory, I'm talking about your ear. We talk about olfaction is your nose. Gustatory is your sense of taste. So these are just kind of more neuroscience-y words for your sensory systems. Your prefrontal cortex, again, is very important for kind of upper level cognitive decision-making things. So a lot of your frontal lobe is kind of dedicated to that. We think about, again, the evolutionary side of things. Humans have probably a more developed frontal lobe than a lot of other species comparatively. As we kind of continue to work our way around the cerebellum, here you can see in the temporal lobe, your primary auditory cortex. Your primary auditory cortex, not surprisingly, is going to be processing the sense of sound that you get. And auditory association areas are located in that region. So your temporal lobe, you can think of as being important for auditory processing, speech. What else do we have here? Speech and language. Yeah, speech and language. Yeah, Wernicke's area, posterior language. Yeah. Okay. So let's keep working our way through the brain. So you have your temporal lobe down here, and then here you have your occipital lobe. So your occipital lobe, again, very important for vision processing. I think I've said that a few different times. You have your primary visual area, your visual association area. And so you've got some secondary visual processing that occurs as well. Let's see what other areas are worth mentioning here. So again, just kind of very generally, somatosensory and motor cortex here in your parietal. Higher order cognitive stuff is happening in your frontal lobe. You can think of your temporal lobe being language, speech, and auditory processing. And then if you kind of just take this little flap of your, and you kind of open up your brain a little bit, you can see there's an insular area, and you can see that there's your primary gustatory taste and your primary olfaction region as well, kind of just located within this region right here. So if you kind of just peel that back just a little bit, open up that little, there's a little almost like knob on the brain of your temporal lobe. So if you pull that back just a little bit, you can see where your sense of taste and your sense of smell are processed on the cerebellum. So again, all of your somatosensory systems are being processed in your cerebellum, and then there also have some higher order cognitive processing that happens in that region as well. Okay, so again, coming back to the tables, the cerebrum, the sensory areas of the cerebral cortex are involved in sensory information, motor areas, such as memory, personality traits, and intelligence. The basal nuclei help initiate and terminate movements and suppress unwanted movements and regulate muscle tone. The limbic system promotes a range of emotions, including pleasure, pain, docility, affection, fear, and anger. So again, limbic system, there's quite a laundry list of structures that are related to that. Again, I think at this point in time, the most important thing for you to take home is just to kind of remember what the function of it is. And some of the general structures are kind of where it's located, but I'm not going to ask you that laundry list of information. This is just showing you hemispheric lateralization, which means that there's some thought that each hemisphere of the brain has slightly different functions. And when I say hemispheres, we've got the two sides of the brain. So you've probably heard the terms left-brained and right-brained, and so that's where this kind of comes from. So your right hemisphere, again, gets slightly different information than your left hemisphere does. So your right hemisphere receives somatic sensory signals from muscles on the left side of the body. So that right side is like musical and artistic awareness, space and pattern perception, recognizes space and emotional context, generating emotional context of language, identifying and discriminating among odors, patients with damage to the right hemisphere corresponding to Broca and Wernicke's area in the left hemisphere speak in a monotonous tone, having lost the ability to impart emotional inflection in what they say. So again, these are all functions that are dedicated to just the right hemisphere. Now, if we look at the left hemisphere, you can see that that receives somatosensory signals from the controls muscles on the right side of the body. So things like reasoning, numerical and scientific skills, the ability to use and understand sign language, spoken and written word, and persons with damaged hemisphere often exhibit aphasia. So you can see here that when I talk about lateralization, essentially it's talking about how their different hemispheres have slightly different functions depending on the side. Okay, so I think this might be our last slide here, brainwaves. So one of the ways in which scientists and doctors kind of determine whether there is brain activity, or meaning AKA whether there are neurons firing action potentials within the brain, is by using a technique called an EEG, an electric encephalogram. And that EEG essentially can measure the electrical firing of the brain. Now, what's interesting is because brain waves fire kind of synchronously, what ends up happening is you have these wave patterns that develop. And so here you can see things like alpha waves, beta waves, theta waves, and delta waves. Now, the way that these waves are characterized is based off of essentially the peaks and valleys and how often those peaks and valleys occur. So you can see the alpha waves are very, very fast waves, and these delta waves are very, very slow waves. And generally, just generally, I would say the peaks and valleys of these waves correlate pretty closely to the level of consciousness or awareness or firing activity of the brain. So most often you see things like delta waves kind of exhibited during patterns of sleep. And then you can see things like alpha waves during periods of intense focus or concentration. So not surprisingly, when you're focusing or concentrating, you've got a lot of neuronal firing that happens. And so you have a very fast wave pattern that kind of ends up getting elicited. Interesting to note though, is while you're sleeping, you would expect to see delta waves the entire time. But if you're going through periods of REM, which REM is rapid eye movement sleep, where your brain almost shifts into a conscious-like state. And because of that, you see brainwave patterns that mimic an awake person's brainwaves, which is, again, it's just kind of a completely separate conversation than what we're having now. But this is just one way to indicate that there is brain or wave activity. This is one way that scientists and doctors would use to assess if somebody is still a viable cognitive candidate. But there are probably a little bit more higher order types of ways to assess that as well. An EEG is a pretty simplistic way to look at brain activity. You can be doing things like MRIs as well, which kind of, again, gives you a more, we'll say, internal idea of what's going on within specific structures of the brain. An EEG essentially happens when you place electrodes on the outside of the skull, and you're able to look at activity of the cerebral cortex. But something like an MRI allows you to gain far more information about some of the internal structures that are important for maintaining life. We talked a lot about the purpose of the thalamus and the hypothalamus and how they're so important and how they're deeply embedded within the brain. So if you're interested in the activity of those types of structures, you'd have to do something like an MRI. But again, if anyone has any questions about either of these, let me know. Okay, so this is kind of part 2 for the first for chapter 12. I'm gonna go ahead and post this today, and then if anyone has any questions, let me know.